The Roadside Incident. We weren't supposed to be on that road in the first place. The main highway was closed for some random construction, and the GPS directed us onto a detour that led us straight into the middle of nowhere. By the time we realized how isolated we were, the sun was already dipping low, painting everything in a weird, shadowy orange. Our plan was just to power through to the nearest town, but right as we were climbing this steep hill, the car jolted and stalled completely. No warning lights, no weird noises beforehand, just dead silence, like the car itself knew something we didn't. We tried calling for help, but of course, there was zero cell service. Typical, right? So, after a bunch of fiddling and cursing, we decided we'd stay put and wait until morning when, hopefully, someone would drive by. We pulled out some blankets, and since it was only supposed to be a temporary stop, we tried to make the best of it. We joked around at first, trying to keep the mood light, but once the sun was fully down, things shifted. You ever been somewhere so quiet it actually makes you uneasy? That's how it felt out there. Just dead silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But it wasn't long before we started noticing other sounds. Faint rustling, not like wind but like something, or someone, moving just outside our line of sight. It was subtle at first, like footsteps in the dry leaves, but as the minutes passed, it got louder, closer, circling us in a way that was way too deliberate to be an animal. At some point, one of my friends, Tom, grabbed a flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. "If anyone's out there, this isn't funny," he called out, sounding braver than I think he actually felt. We all peered into the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of some prankster or even an animal, but there was nothing, just the cold light of the flashlight stretching out into empty trees. When he turned it off, though, that's when we noticed it. Scattered in the dirt around our car were these strange symbols. They weren't obvious at first, like they'd been quickly drawn in a hurry. Small crosses, spirals, and weird shapes I couldn't make out, looping all around the car in a rough circle. I felt my stomach drop. None of us had left the car since it stalled, so how the hell had they gotten there? We all went silent, every bit of laughter from earlier gone. Then, almost as if on cue, the noises started again, closer this time. It was like a slow, methodical crunch of footsteps just beyond the edge of where our headlights reached. We'd shine a flashlight in one direction, and the sound would stop. Then it would pick up again from somewhere else, always just far enough that we couldn't see anything. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, and we all huddled closer together, our backs pressed against the car. I kept telling myself it was just animals, maybe coyotes or something, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Whatever was out there was toying with us, and it knew we couldn't go anywhere. At some point, we decided it was safer to turn off our flashlights and just stay quiet. Maybe if we didn't make any noise, they'd leave us alone. But sitting in the dark only made things worse. My eyes kept darting around, trying to adjust, but all I could see were faint shapes moving just out of reach of the headlights, drifting in and out like shadows. Every so often, I'd catch what looked like a figure, a tall, thin shape or maybe two, but when I'd blink, they'd disappear, like they were never there. One of my friends whispered, "Did you see that?" And the way his voice shook confirmed he'd seen it too. It wasn't just my imagination. The figures were real, and they were circling us, getting closer every time we lost sight of them. The night dragged on like that, hours of creeping terror with no way out. We didn't dare sleep, barely even whispered, each of us frozen with our own thoughts, afraid to make a sound. Sometime in the early hours, just when I thought I couldn't take any more, the footsteps suddenly stopped. Everything went dead quiet. I thought for a second that maybe they'd finally gone. But that's when Tom pointed, his face white as a sheet. Right there, just beyond the headlights, a line of figures was standing, motionless, staring at us. They weren't moving, just watching. We couldn't make out their faces, but the way they stood, all angled toward us in silence. It felt like they'd been waiting for something. None of us knew what to do. We just sat there, barely breathing, hoping they'd vanish if we stayed still long enough. But then one of them took a slow, deliberate step forward, and I felt a wave of panic that nearly made me bolt. Tom muttered under his breath, "We have to go now." Without even thinking, we all grabbed our stuff, stumbling to our feet as quietly as we could, trying not to look directly at those figures just standing there. The moment we started moving, though, they began following us. It wasn't a run or a chase. It was worse. They moved slowly, almost like they were gliding over the ground, keeping just enough distance that we couldn't really see what they looked like. Just knowing they were behind us was enough to keep us going, though. We started walking along the road, not saying a word, just focused on putting as much distance as possible between us and those figures. But every time I looked over my shoulder, I'd see them, still keeping pace. No matter how far we walked, they stayed right there, almost like they were hurting us somewhere. At some point, my legs felt like lead, and the night air was freezing. I remember thinking that maybe if we kept walking, we'd eventually hit the next town, but a tiny part of me feared we'd never get there, that this road would just go on forever with those things behind us. That's when I noticed the symbols again, scratched into the dirt along the road every few yards, like someone, or something, was marking a path for us. Eventually, we came across an old, broken-down fence and thought maybe it meant we were near a house or farm, any place we could get some help. We cut through the fence line, leaving the road, hoping the figures would stop following if we went off their path. But as soon as we stepped into that overgrown field, the footsteps behind us sped up, like they'd been waiting for us to make that exact move. We could hear them, clearer than ever, crunching through the grass in hurried, uneven strides. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would explode, and I could barely breathe. We all just bolted, no plan, no direction, just trying to get away from those footsteps that sounded like they were right behind us, closing in. I don't remember how far we ran, but we eventually stumbled over some rocks and collapsed behind them, trying to catch our breath. I was shaking so badly I could barely hold my flashlight, but when I managed to turn it on, we all froze. Right in front of us, drawn into the dirt between the rocks, was the same trail of symbols. It was like we'd somehow circled back without even realizing it. I looked up, and in the distance, just barely visible, were the headlights of our car, right back where we'd started. And just beyond the car, those figures were still standing there, watching, as if they knew exactly where we'd end up all along. At that point, I felt completely trapped, like no matter what we did, there was no way out of this. We crouched there, paralyzed, staring at the figures by the car, each of us silently hoping they'd just leave. But they didn't move an inch. Then, right as dawn began to creep over the horizon, something shifted. The figures seemed to melt back into the shadows, vanishing one by one until the field was empty. The silence that followed was so thick, I didn't even realize I'd been holding my breath. We didn't talk. We didn't even look at each other. We just walked straight back to the car, hoping maybe it would start now that the night was over. When we got in and turned the key, the engine roared to life like nothing had ever been wrong with it. The second it started, we sped out of there, not looking back even once. After we finally made it to a gas station a couple of towns over, we stopped to catch our breath and tried to make sense of what had happened, but it just felt impossible. The symbols, the figures, the footsteps, every part of it felt like something out of a nightmare. To this day, none of us talk about it, and I still don't know if what we saw was real or if the fear somehow messed with our minds. But every once in a while, I'll have a dream where I'm back on that road, with those symbols surrounding me, and I wake up with the same feeling I had that night, like something is still out there, watching, waiting. The neighbor's window. When I first moved into that apartment, it was the quiet I noticed most. I'd been living in the city for years, and this neighborhood felt worlds apart, almost too calm. The street was lined with old, well-kept houses, the kind where people actually tended their gardens, and it seemed deserted after 9 p.m. For the first few nights, I fell asleep to the hum of silence, which was a rare luxury. But a week in, something strange caught my eye. From my bedroom window, I could see across the street to an old two-story house. Every night, just past midnight, a faint light would flicker in one of the upstairs windows. It seemed harmless at first, probably someone who stayed up late watching TV. But the way the light pulsed was off. It didn't look like a show or any light pattern I'd seen before. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. A few nights later, I found myself awake at midnight again, staring at that window. The same light flickered, but it wasn't random. It seemed to be a pattern, almost like Morse code. I brushed the thought aside. Who on earth would be using Morse code from their window in the middle of the night? But once the idea was there, I couldn't shake it. I Googled a Morse code chart and held my phone up, squinting through my window, trying to catch the sequence of flashes. At first, it didn't make much sense. Just a jumble of letters, nothing coherent. But then, right before the lights stopped for the night, I caught it. A single word that sent a chill down my spine. My name. The next night, I stayed up late, half tempted to let it go, half compelled to find out more. Right on cue, around midnight, the flickering started again, and this time, I was ready. I positioned myself by the window, phone in hand, trying to track the code. The flashes came quicker, almost frantic, like someone was desperate to get a message across. I could feel my pulse quicken with each flash, and as I decoded the letters, the words slowly formed into something chilling. It said, "I see you." I froze, feeling a prickling unease crawl up my spine. Someone across the street knew I was watching, knew I'd been paying attention to their strange signals. I thought about calling someone, maybe the police, but what would I say? Hello, yes, I think someone is blinking lights at me in Morse code. It sounded ridiculous, but the feeling of being watched clung to me, and that night, I barely slept. The next evening, I almost forced myself not to look, but curiosity got the better of me. The flashing started again, and I reluctantly picked up my phone to decode it. This time, the message was worse. It mentioned details that no one should know about me, like my job, the color of my car, even what I had been wearing earlier that day. By this point, I was genuinely freaked out. I kept the curtains drawn tight and tried to convince myself it was all some sick prank. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The following night, I couldn't resist checking again, even though every instinct screamed at me not to. Sure enough, the light began its rhythmic flashing. My hands were shaking as I tried to decode it, each letter filling me with a sinking dread. This time, the message was even more direct. "Come to the window." I stepped back, my heart pounding, refusing to go near the glass. After a few minutes, the light started again, angrier, faster. The words came through choppy but clear enough to understand. "Why are you hiding?" That's when I noticed movement in the dark window across the street. A shadow, just barely visible, like someone was standing there, watching. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those flashing lights, the letters forming twisted messages in my mind. I kept replaying that shadow I'd seen, wondering if I'd imagined it, or if someone was really there, waiting for me to respond. The next day, I tried to act normal, but the fear stuck with me. By the time night fell, I felt trapped, dreading the moment the lights would start again. I debated leaving, going to a friend's place, but part of me needed to know what would happen. When midnight rolled around, I couldn't help it. I peeked out. The light started up again, this time almost immediately, and it felt like it was taunting me. I braced myself and grabbed my phone to decode it one last time. As I pieced together the letters, I felt my blood run cold. "Tonight," it flashed, and then, "Are you ready?" My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear anything else. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the hallway of my building. Slow, deliberate steps. They stopped just outside my door, and I felt this suffocating panic grip me. I didn't dare move, barely breathing, as the silence pressed in. I stood there, frozen, barely able to think. I don't know how long I waited, staring at the door, straining to hear any sound. My mind raced, replaying the messages, wondering if somehow it was all connected. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps slowly faded, moving away from my door and down the hallway. I wanted to convince myself it was just a neighbor, but somehow I knew it wasn't. I backed away from the door, forcing myself not to look outside or even go near the window. The lights across the street had gone dark, but the sense of someone watching me was stronger than ever. I didn't sleep at all that night, waiting for something, anything, to happen. As the first light of morning crept in, I finally gathered the courage to check outside. The house across the street looked completely normal, almost like nothing had happened. No sign of movement, no flickering lights. I kept my curtains shut after that, never looking out at night, not wanting to know if the messages would return. Days passed, and nothing happened, but that eerie feeling never left. To this day, I still can't shake the sensation that someone was, and maybe still is, watching. The shadow in the office. I started noticing the noises on a Tuesday night. It was late, probably around 9 p.m., and I was one of the last ones in the office, which was pretty typical since I had just started this job a couple months back. I guess I was trying to prove myself by staying later than anyone else, but lately, those quiet hours had started to feel different. That night, as I sat there in the dim light from my computer, I heard these faint footsteps. Not loud or obvious, just a soft rhythm coming from above, barely noticeable but enough to make me pause. I figured it was just nerves, or maybe the sound carrying over from the old pipes or creaky floors in this high-rise building. Still, I kept looking up at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was nothing. A few nights later, though, I started hearing this tapping sound. Just a faint, irregular tap that seemed to come from somewhere close. It had this strange pattern, almost like someone was drumming their fingers against a wall. I remember trying to ignore it, but the tapping seemed to get louder, more deliberate, like it was trying to get my attention. I finally stood up and walked around, trying to see if maybe someone else was still here, but the whole floor was empty. I even glanced toward the staircase door, thinking someone might be messing with me, but everything was quiet again. When I got back to my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby, just out of sight. I kept brushing it off, telling myself it was probably just my imagination or the weird acoustics in the building. But one night, around 10 p.m., something happened that I couldn't explain away. I was focused on my screen when I heard the faint ding of the elevator arriving on my floor. Now, that was unusual because the last few people had left hours ago, and I was almost certain nobody else would be coming up this late. I waited, expecting to see one of the security guards or maybe a cleaning crew, but no one stepped out. I stayed in my seat, watching the hallway, but it was empty. Just as I was about to go check, I caught a glimpse of something at the end of the corridor, right beyond the range of the lights. It looked like a figure, just standing there, unmoving. I squinted, but in that dim light, it was impossible to make out any details. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. After that, things started getting even weirder. A couple of days later, I came back from a quick break to find my desk a little off. My mouse wasn't where I'd left it, and a few papers had been shifted around, like someone had been rifling through them. At first, I thought maybe I was just being paranoid, but then it happened again the next day. This time, my coffee mug had been turned, and my keyboard was tilted at an odd angle. It felt like a practical joke, but who would even bother with something like that in an empty office this late? Then came the notes. I was only away from my desk for 5 minutes when I found the first one. Just a few cryptic words typed on my computer screen. Do you hear them? The question made my blood run cold. No one else should have had access to my workstation, and I was sure I'd locked it before stepping out. I looked around, half expecting to see someone hiding nearby, but the office was as empty as ever. I felt a chill and sat there, staring at those words for a long time, trying to wrap my head around how they'd gotten there. I told myself it had to be a glitch or maybe some prank software, but it didn't sit right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been sitting at my desk, watching me, and waiting for me to come back. I tried to talk to one of the security guards about it a few days later, casually mentioning that I'd heard noises from the floor above. His face immediately changed, like he knew something he didn't want to share. After a bit of pressing, he finally admitted that the floor above had been vacant for years. Apparently, some kind of incident had happened, though he wouldn't tell me exactly what. He just said that after whatever went down, no company had ever stayed long. I laughed it off in front of him, saying it must just be my imagination, but inside, I was starting to seriously worry. If that floor was empty, then who or what was walking around up there? After my talk with security, things only got worse. Every night, I was on edge, waiting for something to happen. Sure enough, I'd catch small things. The squeak of a chair being moved in a distant part of the office, the sound of footsteps again, faint but distinct, just above my head. One night, I even heard what sounded like a muffled conversation. Only it was just one voice, low and monotone, like someone talking to themselves. I went up to check it out, which felt stupid in the moment, but the curiosity was killing me. The stairwell door to the floor above was chained shut, and the space behind it was dark, but as I stood there, I swore I heard that tapping again, right on the other side of the door. The final straw happened the following Friday night. I had stayed late to finish a report, and around 11 p.m., I went to grab a drink. When I came back, there was another note on my screen, but this time it was different. It said, "I see you." I felt this wave of dread and turned to look behind me, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the office was as empty as ever. I logged out, grabbed my things, and practically ran for the elevator. Just as the doors were about to close, I heard something from down the hall. Footsteps, heavy and slow, getting closer. I jammed the elevator button frantically until it finally started descending. As I looked back, just before the doors shut completely, I saw that figure again, standing at the end of the hallway, watching. I didn't go back to the office over the weekend. I kept trying to tell myself that it was all just stress, that I was overreacting, but a part of me knew there was something real happening in that building. Monday rolled around, and I felt like I didn't have much of a choice. I couldn't just quit without a backup plan. I went in, but I could barely focus all day. By evening, most of my coworkers had left, and the familiar quiet settled in. My nerves were so frayed that every sound made me jump. Around 9 p.m., as I was packing up, I heard that familiar ding of the elevator again. The same one that had mysteriously opened on my floor before. This time, though, it didn't open fully. It just paused, the doors only part-way open, like it was stuck. I stood there watching, when I noticed a shadow move inside the gap between the doors. It looked like someone standing in the elevator, just waiting. I couldn't see a face, just a dark outline of a person. I backed up slowly, half hoping the doors would shut and the elevator would move on, but they stayed just like that, slightly open, with the shadow inside. After what felt like an eternity, I turned and hurried toward the staircase instead, not daring to look back. As I descended the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps echoing down the empty stairwell. About halfway to the lobby, I heard a door creak open a few floors above, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, steady, deliberate, and slowly coming down. I quickened my pace, heart pounding as I realized that whoever was behind me was matching my steps, one floor at a time. I resisted the urge to look back, every instinct screaming at me to keep moving, to get out as fast as I could. By the time I reached the ground floor, the footsteps had stopped, but I didn't pause to investigate. I sprinted toward the main exit, practically shoving through the lobby doors into the cold night air. Outside, I stopped to catch my breath and looked up at the building. My office floor was dark, except for one small light near my desk that I was sure I'd turned off. And there, by the window, I could make out a faint silhouette, standing completely still, watching me from the shadows. I left that job soon after, and to this day, I still wonder what, or who, I saw. But one thing's for sure, I'm never working late in an office alone again. The hiker's discovery. I decided to head off the main trail in the national park, hoping to find a secluded spot where I could set up camp without running into anyone. I've done solo hiking for years, so I'm used to exploring off the beaten path. But that day, something just felt different. The trees seemed a little closer, the forest denser than usual. As dusk started setting in, I stumbled upon a campsite tucked behind some tall pines. At first, I thought it was just another hiker's spot, but as I got closer, I realized it looked off. There was a tent, half collapsed, with belongings scattered around, a small backpack, a pair of hiking boots, and a damp, half-burnt journal. The ashes around the fire pit were still faintly warm, which made the whole scene feel strange, like whoever had been here left in a hurry. Curiosity got the best of me, and I picked up the journal. It was wet, probably from the damp ground, and some of the pages were smudged, but I could still make out bits of writing. Most of it was just typical stuff, notes about the weather, places the hiker had passed, but then I found some entries that didn't sit right with me. One page mentioned hearing voices at night, and another talked about figures watching from the trees. The more I read, the more uncomfortable I felt. Whoever had written this seemed genuinely terrified, like they weren't alone in the woods, even though there wasn't another trail for miles. I knew I should have left the journal and walked away, but something kept me there, reading, until the light was almost gone. By the time I looked up from the journal, it was getting dark fast, and I still hadn't set up my own tent. I decided to camp close to this site. I figured I'd just borrow the fire pit for the night. But as I gathered wood and started a small fire, I couldn't shake the unease building up inside me. The forest around felt way too quiet, with only the crackling of the fire breaking the silence. I kept glancing over at the abandoned tent and scattered belongings, half expecting someone to come back at any moment, but nobody showed. There was just me, the fire, and the heavy silence pressing down on the woods around me. As the night wore on, I tried to relax, telling myself I'd be fine if I just focused on getting some rest. But not long after I lay down in my tent, I started hearing things. At first, faint whispers that I couldn't make out. I brushed it off as the wind moving through the trees, but it didn't sound quite right. It was like a low, muttering conversation happening just beyond the reach of my campfire light. When I sat up to listen, it stopped. But as soon as I lay back down, it started again, a little closer this time. I tried telling myself it was nothing, maybe just my mind playing tricks on me after reading those disturbing entries, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was just outside my camp, watching. I must have dozed off at some point, but I woke up to the sound of something rustling outside my tent. My heart was pounding, but I tried to stay still and quiet, listening to whatever was moving just outside. It wasn't a deer or any animal I was used to hearing in the woods. This was slower, deliberate. It circled my camp, pausing every now and then. I held my breath, hoping it would pass, but then I heard something even worse. Low whispers, right outside the thin fabric of my tent. I couldn't make out any words, just the sound of voices blending together, like a hushed conversation. Every instinct told me to get up and run, but I was paralyzed, too afraid to move. After what felt like an eternity, the whispers stopped, and the rustling faded into the woods. I lay there, too afraid to even look outside, gripping my flashlight like it was a lifeline. Somehow, I managed to fall back asleep, clutching that flashlight, but it was the kind of sleep that didn't bring any rest. When I finally crawled out of my tent at dawn, everything felt eerily normal. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, that maybe I'd let the creepy journal and the silence of the woods get to me. But then, as I was packing up, I noticed something that froze me in place. My backpack had been moved. It was sitting a few feet from where I'd left it, partially unzipped, with my own notebook lying open on top. I hadn't touched my notebook since I'd gotten to the campsite, so seeing it out like that didn't make any sense. My hands were shaking as I picked it up, flipping through the pages. Most of it looked the same, but on a fresh page near the middle, there was something new. A single line written in uneven, jagged handwriting. "You're next." I felt this wave of nausea hit me, like I'd been punched in the stomach. I knew for a fact that I hadn't written those words, and there was no one else around. At least, no one that I could see. I scanned the forest line, half expecting to catch a glimpse of someone, but everything looked empty, silent, the way it had when I'd first arrived. I can't describe the feeling that settled over me in that moment. It was pure dread, like the forest itself was watching, waiting. I packed up as fast as I could, barely even checking if I'd left anything behind. Every sound, every crunch of a twig under my boots, felt like it was echoing through the trees. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half running down the trail as soon as I could find it again. Even in broad daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was right behind me. It didn't matter how fast I walked. I felt like I was being followed, like the shadows themselves were creeping closer. When I finally made it back to the main trail, I didn't stop moving until I reached the ranger station. I considered telling someone about the abandoned campsite and what I'd found, but honestly, I doubted they'd believe me. I mean, what could I say? That I'd read a journal talking about voices in the woods and then heard them myself? That someone or something had crept around my tent in the middle of the night and left a message in my own notebook? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. So I just kept my mouth shut, signed out at the station, and headed straight to my car. It's been months since that night, but I still think about it. Sometimes I wonder if someone or something was really watching me from the trees, just like that person had written in the journal. I tried looking up missing hiker reports from that area, but nothing came up. It's like whoever left that campsite just disappeared without a trace. I haven't been back to that park since, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. Every time I go hiking now, even on busy trails, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I keep waiting to hear those whispers again, and when I sleep, I dream of shadows circling just beyond the firelight, waiting for their chance to step closer.